I love the people I work with. I love the people I...
He spat on stages, cursed at cameras, declared there was no future, and ignited a movement that terrified an entire generation of parents. But behind Johnny Rotten's venomous snarl, an anarchist, persona was a record collection so rich, strange, and intellectual, it would leave even the most hardcore punk fans stunned into silence. This was not the man you thought you knew. This was someone whose musical influences went far beyond 3 chords and a safety pin. Welcome to the real John LaDonna, man who devoured experimental jazz, worshipped German surrealists, and found soul in orchestral nightmares. While the public labeled him a menace and punk's nuclear warhead, behind the scenes, he was poring over records that most rebels wouldn't dare touch, dissecting sounds that pushed far beyond the bounds of acceptability and into a realm of true, fearless creation. These weren't just guilty pleasures. They were obsessions that defined his identity far more than his mohawk ever did. Rotten wasn't inspired by chaos. For chaos' sake, he was driven by artists who refused to compromise, who alienated their fans to remain honest, and who tore down their own success in pursuit of something purer. His 6 favorite artists of Johnny Rotten will flip everything you assumed about punk's angriest voice. Because while the world saw a guy who wanted to burn it all down, what they missed was a thinker and artist who was carefully building his own sonic universe brick by unpredictable brick. What follows isn't a list, it's a revelation. By the end of it, you'll realize that rebellion doesn't always scream it, sometimes whispers through strange harmonies, echoing dubs and voices that sound like they came from another planet, ready to hear what Rotten was really listening to when no one was watching. Let's dive into the shocking truth behind punk's most misunderstood rebel, Asterisk. Coming in at number 6 on Johnny Rotten's list of favorite artists is none other than the unclassifiable, uncompromising sonic anarchist himself, Captain Beefheart. And while the name might raise an eyebrow, for Rotten, this wasn't some ironic pick or underground flex-it, was the closest thing to a musical soulmate he ever had. Rotten discovered Trout Mask Replica, Beefheart's legendary avant-garde masterwork, in the mid-1970s through a friend. The experience wasn't passive, it was transformative. According to Glenn Matlock, Rotten would blast the album endlessly, telling anyone within earshot, this is what real rebellion sounds like. And it wasn't about the chaos on the surface, it was about the intention underneath. Where most artists chased fame, radio play, and sanitized palatability, Beefheart operated in a different dimension, one where the rules of music, melody, and even logic were irrelevant. For Rotten, that rejection of convention was the essence of punk before punk had a name. Beefheart wasn't creating to please anyone. He was inventing a new language of art. Rotten called it pure art without compromise, a phrase he reserved for only the most fearless. It wasn't just fandom, it was blueprint. In his work with Public Image Limited, Rotten borrowed directly from Beefheart's rhythmic unpredictability, anti-melodic structure, and vocal abstraction. He studied how Beefheart could twist a phrase, turn a beat upside down, and make music that actively dared you to hate it. It was ugly, it was beautiful, it was impossible, and that's why it was honest. In interviews, Rotten would lash out at critics who dismissed Beefheart as unlistenable, spitting back, if it's easy to digest, it's not challenging anything. For him, the very act of being difficult was sacred. Beefheart wasn't just breaking the mold, he was erasing the idea that a mold should ever exist. He didn't just rebel against the industry, he created a world where the industry didn't even apply. Rotten viewed this as the highest form of art, not attention-seeking noise, but intellectual rebellion. It's not destruction for spectacle, but for the sake of reimagining what sound could be. Don Van Vliet, Captain Beefheart's real name, wasn't just a musician to Rotten. He was the prophet of a parallel universe where music wasn't chained to approval, success, or even sense. And in that universe, Rotten saw himself not as a follower, but as a believer. Asterisk. At number 5 sits perhaps the most baffling name to anyone who only knew Johnny Rotten from his snarling Sex Pistols days, Scott Walker, the former heartthrob from the Walker Brothers turned reclusive, experimental genius whose music morphed from teen ballads into terrifying orchestral hallucinations. For Rotten, this wasn't just admiration, it was revelation. He discovered Walker's solo work in 1976 during his pre-fame years, stumbling upon it in a record shop, and from the moment he heard those brooding, haunting arrangements, he was hooked. Not on the nostalgia, but on the audacity. Here was a man who willingly destroyed his own mainstream appeal to chase something real. An artist who ran headlong into darkness and carved emotion out of sound so terrifying it barely qualified as music. Rotten told Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren he went from teen idol to complete artistic madman. That's real punk, and that's where the connection lies. For Rotten, rebellion was never about volume, it was about honesty. Scott Walker, to him, represented the scariest kind of rebellion, abandoning what makes you beloved in pursuit of what makes you truthful. Rotten was captivated by what he called orchestral nightmares and beautiful terror, describing Walker's music as emotionally nuclear, capable of expressing things ordinary songs couldn't even approach. This influence wasn't theoretical either. In his later years with Public Image Limited, Rotten embraced long-form experimentation, dissonant arrangements, and theatrical delivery that owed more to Walker than to punk's primitive roots. Bandmates reported him obsessively studying Walker's vocal dynamics in the studio, dissecting the fear, the drama, the vulnerability in every note. He praised Walker not just for what he created, but for what he sacrificed, saying that walking away from success to protect your artistic vision is the hardest thing a musician can do. Critics who mourned the loss of Walker's pop career didn't get it, and Rotten wasn't shy about saying so. He defended Walker as a giant who chose truth over comfort, evolution over repetition, and emotional annihilation over applause. 4. Rotten Walker wasn't just an artist. He was a challenge, a dare, a mirror showing what it really takes to be free. And in embracing that darkness, Johnny Rotten didn't just honor Walker, he emulated him. Coming in at number 4 is a figure so unorthodox, so completely untethered from musical norms. It's almost poetic how deeply Johnny Rotten revered Himley Scratch Perry, the Jamaican dub pioneer whose mixing board became a battleground. For sonic warfare, unlike typical reggae appreciation, Rotten wasn't drawn to Perry for cultural or political reasons. What grabbed him was Perry's chaotic genius, the way he transformed the studio from a place of polish into a portal of madness. The moment Rotten heard Perry's dub experiments at a friend's Notting Hill flat, as recounted by journalist Caroline Kuhn, he was struck like lightning. "This man is turning music inside out and upside down," Rotten declared. "He's not just making records, he's creating new realities." And that was it. Rotten was obsessed, because Perry wasn't a producer. He was a sound anarchist. He manipulated echo, delay, reverb, and silence itself to construct otherworldly landscapes that defied every law of musical structure. In Perry, Rotten saw a kindred spirit, someone who didn't just bend rules but made it impossible to know where the rules ever were. Perry's controlled chaos, as Rotten called it, was both philosophy and technique, turning accident into art and confusion into feeling. Where mainstream producers sought perfection, Perry celebrated imperfection as proof of humanity, soul, and truth. Rotten defended Perry against critics who labeled him self-indulgent or incoherent, insisting that genius often looks like insanity, especially when it's ahead of its time. The influence seeped into Rotten's own sonic experiments, where dub's spatial techniques began shaping how he approached not just rhythm, but silence. In interviews, he talked about how Perry taught him that the absence of sound could be as weaponized as the noise itself. It's that power lives in space, echo, and pause. Dub to Rotten wasn't just reggae. It was deconstruction, demolition, and dangerous art. He even called Perry a mad scientist whose lab was the studio and whose chemicals were feedback and delay. And perhaps most importantly, he felt seen. "We're both outsiders who refuse to play by established rules," Rotten once said. Whether that's punk rules or reggae rules, Lee Perry's genius wasn't just sonic, it was philosophical. And for Rotten, it was a roadmap to freedom. In a world where genres became cages and expectations dictated creativity, Perry was the madman who lit the match, and Rotten was ready to watch it all burn. Asterisk number 3 on Johnny Rotten's list isn't just unexpected, It's borderline heretical to punk orthodoxy. Graaf Generator, the notoriously complex prog rock band, stood for everything punk supposedly hated: long songs, theatrical performances, and dense musical arrangements. And yet Rotten was completely enamored. But not for the reasons critics would assume. He didn't love them despite their complexity. He loved them because they channeled overwhelming emotion through it. According to Malcolm McLaren, Rotten first encountered the band at a 1975 house party. When someone dropped Pawn Hearts on the record player, as Peter Hamill's voice tore through the speakers like a man possessed, Rotten stood frozen, transfixed, and later whispered, "That man screams like his life depends on it." It wasn't technical wizardry that moved him, it was the raw, undiluted intensity that lived inside those labyrinthine arrangements. To Rotten, Graaf Generator proved that you could be intelligent and emotional, theatrical and sincere, intricate and dangerous all at the same time. While other prog bands were lost in their own egos, Graaf channeled violence and beauty into compositions that didn't feel bloated but vital. Rotten described their sound as beautiful. Violence where classical power collided with punk rage in a way that felt more honest than anything on the radio. This influence echoed through his own work, especially in Public Image Limited, where longer structures and erratic shifts became a way to amplify, not suppress emotion. Bandmates recalled Rotten studying Hamill's delivery, fascinated by how drama didn't have to feel fake when rooted in pain. He saw complexity not as self-indulgent, but as a new form of rebellion. And when punk purists attacked him for praising prog, Rotten didn't back down. He fired back with precision. Intelligence doesn't make music less powerful, it makes it more dangerous, because it knows exactly where to strike. That's the punk ethos in its truest form, at ignorance but weaponized knowledge.
4.
Rotten Graaf Generator wasn't an exception. They were an evolution. It's a reminder that rebellion isn't about how loud or fast your song is. It's about how deeply it cuts into these songs. Cut like surgical knives dressed in orchestra suits. Asterisk at number 2 is perhaps the most revealing choice of all. Neil Young, the Canadian folk rock legend, best known for melancholy ballads and gritty guitar solos. On the surface, Neil Young and Johnny Rotten couldn't seem more different. One sang about Heart of Gold, the other screamed anthems of anarchy. But Rotten wasn't listening to the surface. What drew him in was Young's fearless rejection of expectation, his refusal to be boxed in by fame or genre. Rotten discovered Tonight's the Night in 1976, well before his Sex Pistols infamy. And according to Steve Jones, he played it obsessively. Not because it was polished, quite the opposite. The raw, broken, disoriented energy of that record mirrored exactly what Rotten believed music should be. Messy, painful, honest. "This guy doesn't care if people like what he's doing," Rotten reportedly said. "He just follows his instincts, even if it destroys his career." That struck a chord deeper than any 3-chord punk riff ever could. But Young didn't just rebel against the music industry, he rebelled against his own fans, sabotaging his own success whenever it became too predictable. Rotten saw that as the highest form of integrity. He was so inspired by Young's artistic restlessness that he modeled his own decisions on it, refusing to reform the Sex Pistols for nostalgia money, constantly shifting direction with Public Image Limited, and defending his most unpopular choices by citing Young's unflinching creative courage. In interviews, Rotten said Young was proof that evolution is the only true path to longevity, and that staying true to your inner compass is the ultimate rebellion. Neil Young, too. Rotten was more punk than most punks, because while others were screaming rebellion, Young lived it quietly, brutally, and on his own terms. He showed Rotten that the real enemy wasn't authority, it was stagnation. And in doing so, he became not just an influence, but a spiritual guide for a man who built a career out of defying expectations at every turn. Asterisk finally, at number 1. We reach Johnny Rotten's most shocking, personal, and haunting favorite of them all. Nico the Enigmatic. German-born singer who once fronted the Velvet Underground, but carved out a far darker solo path afterward. This wasn't just admiration, it was obsession. Rotten reportedly discovered the Marble Index in 1974 at a London record shop. And from that moment on, he was transfixed. According to biographer John Savage, Rotten would tell friends, she sings like she's already dead, but somehow more alive than anyone else. For him, Nico represented something no other artist dared touch: absolute emotional detachment wrapped in unbearable honesty. She didn't try to please, didn't smile for the camera, didn't soften her edges. She made music that was cold, harsh, and indifferent to reception. Rotten called it beautiful isolation, a sound that didn't beg for approval but simply existed on its own cruel terms. In Nico's refusal to compromise or connect, he saw the essence of true artistic bravery. Unlike most musicians who crave audience engagement, Nico seemed to reject the listener entirely, and in doing so, drew Rotten deeper in. Saw her not as a performer, but as a ghost channeling the unbearable weight of existence, he praised. Her refusal to be digestible, to be friendly, or to be explained. She never tried to be likable, Rotten once said, and that's the most honest thing any artist can do. The influence was profound. Rotten adopted that same cold detachment. In his later performances, leaning into discomfort, silence, and emotional distance as tools to challenge audiences. For him, Nico was not just a singer, it was a statement, philosophy, an echo from the void that dared you to listen without reward. She proved that you don't have to shout to be terrifying, that whispering can be even more unsettling. And in that chilling silence, Rotten didn't just hear music. He heard the sound of someone refusing to lie. In a world addicted to applause, Nico was the void. And Rotten stared into it, saw himself, and never looked away. Asterisk. So now that we've shattered every stereotype about Johnny Rotten, what do we really have left? It's not a rabid punk anarchist screaming into the void, but a quiet, thoughtful student of art who built his rage not out of ignorance, but out of reverence. For those who dared to tell the truth no matter the cost. What we've uncovered in this list is more than just a mixtape. It's a manifesto. From Captain Beefheart's deranged anti-commercialism to Nico's spectral isolation, from Scott Walker's orchestrated descent into madness to Neil Young's self-sabotaging genius. Every artist on this list served as a mirror in which Rotten saw what he wanted to be: uncompromising, evolving, and real. And in choosing these artists, Rotten wasn't betraying punk. He was revealing what it truly was. It's not a genre, not a uniform, but a mindset, a way of seeing the world and refusing to let it define you. Yeah. He found rebellion in silence, in dissonance, in sorrow, and in isolation. And in doing so, he redefined what it means to be dangerous. Rotten didn't listen to music for entertainment, he listened to be changed. He wasn't looking for an escape, he was looking for a confrontation. And these artists gave it to him in spades. So, the next time you see an old Sex Pistols clip and think you've got Johnny Rotten figured out, remember this list. Remember that punk's angriest voice had the most poetic ears? 'Cause at the heart of all that rage, all that volume, and all that controversy was a man quietly building a cathedral of sound, one record at a time, one broken rule after another.